I'm Destiny Johnson, 47 years old, and 3 years ago I experienced something that opened my eyes to how deeply housing discrimination still runs in America today. I thought I was just buying a house, but what I discovered was a system designed to keep people like me out of certain neighborhoods. But what happened next taught me something even more important about fighting back against systemic racism and the power of refusing to be invisible. If you've ever felt like you had to prove you belonged somewhere that should have welcomed you from the start, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this experience. Let me take you back to 2018, when I first started looking for a house in Maplewood Heights. I'd been renting in the city for 15 years, working my way up from a junior marketing coordinator to regional director at a tech company. The company had just relocated our main office to the suburbs, and my daily commute had gone from 20 minutes to over an hour each way. My daughter Zara was starting high school, and I wanted her to have access to the advanced placement programs and college prep courses that Maplewood was famous for. The test scores were incredible, the graduation rates impressive, and when I drove through those tree-lined streets with their pristine sidewalks and manicured lawns, I could picture Zara walking to school, maybe joining the debate team or the robotics club. The numbers made sense too. After years of careful saving and a recent promotion that came with a substantial raise, I could afford the mortgage payments on houses in the $350,000 to $400,000 range. I'd done my research, spent weekends driving through different neighborhoods, and Maplewood Heights consistently checked every box. Low crime rates, excellent schools, convenient shopping, and a 20-minute commute to my office. The community seemed welcoming from the outside. I'd seen families of various backgrounds at the parks and local coffee shops. There was even a cultural center that hosted international food festivals and community events throughout the year. I remember the first time I called a realtor about a listing in Maplewood Heights. It was a beautiful colonial on Elm Street with 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, and a big backyard perfect for the garden I'd always wanted to plant. The listing photos showed hardwood floors throughout, a renovated kitchen with granite countertops, and large windows that filled every room with natural light. When I called the number on the sign, the agent Derek Matthews sounded enthusiastic and professional. He scheduled a showing for that Saturday afternoon and asked about my budget and timeline. I felt that familiar flutter of excitement you get when something important feels like it's falling into place. For the next 2 years, I threw myself into establishing roots in what I hoped would become my community. I joined the Maplewood Community Center and volunteered for their annual fundraising gala, spending countless evening hours helping with event planning and donor outreach. My marketing background proved invaluable, and I ended up leading their social media campaign that resulted in a 40% increase in attendance and donations compared to the previous year. The board members were impressed, and I was invited to join the planning committee as a permanent member. I also became a regular at the Saturday farmers market, getting to know vendors by name and learning about which stalls had the best seasonal produce. Mrs. Patterson, who sold homemade preserves, always saved me a jar of her special strawberry rhubarb jam, and Tom Chen, who ran the organic vegetable stand, would recommend new recipes for whatever I was buying. I started bringing Zara with me, and she developed her own relationships with the vendors, especially Maria, who taught her basic Spanish phrases while weighing out fresh herbs. At work, my success continued to build. I'd spearheaded a campaign that brought in 3 major clients and increased our department's revenue by 25%. My colleagues respected my strategic thinking and often sought my input on challenging projects. I was invited to represent our company at industry conferences and had been featured in Marketing Weekly as one of 30 under 40 rising stars. Well, I was actually 44, but they counted the years since my career change from teaching to marketing. The recognition felt incredible. Validation that all those late nights and weekend work sessions were paying off. During this golden period, I felt more confident and successful than I ever had. My typical Saturday would start with coffee and bagels at Cornerstone Cafe, where the barista Jake knew my order by heart: large oat milk latte with an extra shot and a toasted everything bagel with cream cheese. I'd sit at the window table reading the newspaper while watching families bike past on their way to the community center. The sense of belonging was intoxicating. I'd picture myself in 5 years, maybe running for the school board or organizing neighborhood improvement projects. I started attending town hall meetings and community events, always taking notes and asking thoughtful questions about local issues. When the city proposed budget cuts to the after-school programs, I presented a detailed analysis of how these programs impacted working families and suggested alternative funding sources. The mayor actually thanked me personally after the meeting and asked if I'd consider joining the Education Advisory Committee. My future felt not just secure but bright. I'd been pre-approved for a mortgage up to $425,000, and I'd found a financial advisor who helped me plan for Zara's college expenses while building my retirement savings. I'd even started designing my ideal home office in my head, complete with built-in bookshelves and a window overlooking the garden I'd plant with vegetables from Maria's farm stand recipes. But looking back now, there were warning signs I rationalized away or didn't recognize at the time. During community center meetings, my suggestions were often met with polite smiles but rarely implemented, even when they were clearly good ideas that saved money or increased efficiency. I noticed I was frequently the only Black person in these rooms, but I told myself that was just demographics. The area would become more diverse over time as more families like mine discovered its benefits. When I'd run into neighbors while out walking, conversations felt slightly stilted, like people were being friendly but maintaining a certain distance. I attributed this to typical suburban reserve rather than anything more problematic. At networking events, I sometimes felt like I had to work harder to break into conversations or that people seemed surprised by my professional credentials, but I'd experienced that throughout my career and had learned to navigate it with extra preparation and confidence. The day everything became crystal clear started like any other house hunting Saturday. I'd scheduled 3 showings with Derek Matthews, including a stunning Tudor-style home on Maple Avenue that had just come on the market. The house was everything I'd been dreaming of: 5 bedrooms, a finished basement, and a price point right in my range at $389,000. The online photos showed a cozy living room with a brick fireplace, a spacious kitchen with an island perfect for Zara's homework sessions, and a master suite with a walk-in closet that could fit my entire current wardrobe twice over. I met Derek at his office at 9 a.m. sharp, wearing my favorite navy blazer and carrying a leather portfolio with my pre-approval letter, financial statements, and a list of prepared questions about each property. Derek greeted me with his usual professional smile, but something felt different from our previous meetings. He seemed distracted, checking his phone more than usual, and asking questions he'd already asked before about my timeline and seriousness as a buyer. Before we head out, Derek said, adjusting his tie and avoiding direct eye contact, "I want to make sure we're looking at properties that are the right fit for your situation." The pause before situation lasted just a beat too long. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the same feeling I'd learned to recognize in corporate conference rooms when someone was about to say something coded. "What do you mean by my situation?" I asked, keeping my voice steady and professional. Derek's smile became more forced. "Well, some neighborhoods have different personalities, different types of families. I just want to make sure you'll be comfortable and that your daughter will fit in with the other kids." The words hit me like cold water. After 2 years of community involvement, professional success, and careful financial planning, I was being told that my comfort and my daughter's ability to fit in were questions worth raising. Not my creditworthiness, not my ability to afford the homes we'd discussed, but whether we were the right type of family for Maplewood Heights. "I have a pre-approval letter for $425,000, I said, pulling the document from my portfolio. "My credit score is 760, and I have a 20% down payment ready." "What exactly about my situation concerns you?" Derek's face flushed red. No, that's not what I meant at all. Your financials are excellent. I just meant, well, some sellers have preferences about, maintaining the neighborhood character." Neighborhood character, there it was. The phrase that every Black homebuyer learns to decode, usually the hard way. I sat in my car in Derek's parking lot for 10 minutes after I walked out of his office, hands shaking as I tried to process what had just happened. My first instinct was to doubt myself. Maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe Derek was just awkward with words and genuinely trying to help me find the right community. Maybe neighborhood character meant something innocent about architectural styles or community values. But the more I replayed the conversation, the more obvious the subtext became. The pause before situation, the emphasis on fitting in, The assumption that sellers might have preferences that would exclude me despite my excellent credit and substantial down payment. This wasn't about my qualifications as a buyer. This was about my race. I called my sister Maya from the car, my voice still shaky with adrenaline and disbelief. "He actually said neighborhood character?" Maya asked, her voice tight with familiar anger. "Girl, that's not even code anymore, that's just straight up discrimination with a euphemism attached." "But maybe I'm reading too much into it," I said, even though I knew I wasn't. "Maybe he was just trying to be helpful." "Destiny," Maya said firmly, "you've been house hunting for 6 months. Has he ever questioned whether you'd be comfortable in any of the other neighborhoods you've looked at? Has he ever worried about whether Zara would fit in anywhere else?" She was right. We'd toured homes in 4 different communities, and Derek had never once expressed concern about my comfort level or cultural fit. He'd never suggested that sellers might have preferences about the type of family they wanted in their home. The only difference with Maplewood Heights was that it was the most expensive and most predominantly white area I'd been considering. I spent the rest of that weekend researching Maplewood Heights' demographic history and current housing patterns. What I found was disturbing but not surprising. The community had been developed in the 1950s with racially restrictive covenants that explicitly prohibited sales to black families. While those covenants were legally unenforceable after the Fair Housing Act, the neighborhood had remained over 85% white through decades of informal barriers and steering practices. I found online forums where real estate agents discussed maintaining community standards and preserving property values in ways that made their racial implications clear. I discovered that the average time homes stayed on the market in Maplewood Heights was significantly longer for certain listing agents known for working with diverse clients. And I learned that several advocacy organizations had filed complaints about discriminatory practices in the area, though most were settled quietly without admission of wrongdoing. The pattern recognition phase began immediately after that first awakening. Once I knew what to look for, discriminatory behaviors became impossible to ignore. I decided to test my theory by having Maya, who is lighter-skinned and often passes for white over the phone, call the same real estate agencies I'd contacted. The difference in treatment was stark and immediate. When Maya called Derek's office asking about the same Tudor house on Maple Avenue, she was immediately scheduled for a showing and told about 2 other properties that had just come on the market but weren't listed online yet. The agent she spoke with, Derek's colleague Jennifer, was enthusiastic and helpful, offering to pre-screen properties based on Maya's stated preferences and even suggesting a mortgage broker who works wonders for our preferred clients. When I called Jennifer's direct line 2 days later, identifying myself as a potential buyer interested in the same properties, the energy completely shifted. Jennifer was polite but distant, explaining that the Tudor house had multiple offers already and suggesting I might be more interested in homes in transitioning neighborhoods that offered great value opportunities. When I mentioned my budget and pre-approval amount, she seemed surprised and asked if I'd considered looking in areas with more diversity that might be more culturally aligned with my background. I started documenting these interactions in detail, taking notes on exact phrases, dates, and the names of everyone involved. I recorded phone calls when legally permitted and saved email exchanges that showed patterns of differential treatment. What emerged was a clear picture of systematic steering. Black buyers like me were consistently directed away from certain neighborhoods and toward others, regardless of our financial qualifications or stated preferences. The environmental settings where this bias appeared were varied but predictable. Open houses in predominantly white neighborhoods would be welcoming until I mentioned my interest in actually purchasing, at which point agents would suddenly remember concerns about the school district boundaries or suggest other properties in different areas. Mortgage brokers would recommend different loan products for me than for white clients with similar credit profiles, often with higher interest rates or stricter terms. Even my own company's relocation specialist, when helping me explore housing options near our new office, steered me toward communities that were more diverse but required longer commutes or had fewer amenities. When I asked directly about Maplewood Heights, she wrinkled her nose and said it might be challenging for someone with my background to feel welcome there. My research uncovered institutional patterns that went beyond individual agents. The Maplewood Heights Homeowners Association had a history of filing nuisance complaints against Black families who did manage to buy homes in the area, noise violations for children playing outside, landscaping infractions for gardens that didn't match community standards, and parking citations for visitors' cars. These complaints created an atmosphere of hypervigilance and constant scrutiny that effectively discouraged Black families from staying long-term. The cliffhanger moment came when I discovered that 3 Black families had successfully purchased homes in Maplewood Heights over the past 5 years, but all had sold and moved away within 18 months. When I reached out to one of these families through social media, the wife agreed to meet me for coffee and share her experience. "We thought we were being paranoid at first," she told me, stirring her latte nervously. "Little things, you know. Neighbors who wouldn't make eye contact. Kids who weren't invited to birthday parties. Our lawn service canceled on us suddenly saying they were overbooked, but they kept servicing houses on both sides of us." She described escalating incidents, packages mysteriously disappearing, their car being keyed in their own driveway, and anonymous notes in their mailbox, suggesting they'd be more comfortable in other communities. When they tried to organize a neighborhood block party to build relationships, only 2 families agreed to participate, and both canceled at the last minute. The final straw was when someone called Child Protective Services and reported that our kids were being neglected because they were playing in our own backyard unsupervised, she said, her voice still carrying the trauma of that experience. The investigator was apologetic and said it was clearly a false report, but the message was clear. We weren't wanted and they were willing to involve our children to make that point. This conversation crystallized my understanding of how systematic discrimination works. It's not just about being denied the opportunity to buy a home, it's about creating an environment so hostile that Black families choose to leave even after they've successfully purchased properties. The goal isn't just exclusion. It's the creation of a self-perpetuating system where the lack of diversity becomes justification for continued discriminatory practices. The allyship test came during a community center meeting I attended as a volunteer committee member. The topic was budget planning for the upcoming year, and I was presenting my analysis of program effectiveness and cost optimization strategies. I'd spent weeks preparing detailed reports showing how we could increase program capacity while reducing administrative overhead. Halfway through my presentation, board member Robert Henley interrupted me. "This is all very interesting," he said with a dismissive wave, "but I think we need to focus on programs that serve our actual community members rather than trying to attract outside populations." The room fell silent. Every person in that meeting knew exactly what outside populations meant, and every person in that room made a choice about how to respond to that statement. I looked around the table, making eye contact with people I'd worked alongside for months, people who had praised my contributions and invited me to join committees. Committee Chair Linda Morrison cleared her throat uncomfortably. "Robert, I think Destiny's analysis is quite thorough. Perhaps we should, I'm just saying," Robert continued, his voice rising slightly, "we need to be careful about changing too much too fast. Some of these new programs might attract the wrong element to our community events." The wrong element. There it was again, that coded language that everyone understood but no one wanted to name directly. I felt my heart racing as I looked around the room again. This was my moment to see who would stand up for basic decency and who would let discrimination slide by in polite silence. The silence stretched for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds. Finally, Dr. Sarah Kim, a pediatrician who had joined the committee recently, spoke up. "Robert, I think that comment is inappropriate and not in line with our community values. Destiny's analysis is excellent, and her recommendations would benefit everyone in our community." The response was swift and telling. 2 other committee members immediately backed Dr. Kim, expressing appreciation for the thoroughness of my work and suggesting we vote on implementing several of my recommendations. But 5 members remained silent, studying their papers or staring at the table, choosing political comfort over moral clarity. Robert's face flushed red with anger. "I'm not saying anything racist," he snapped. "I'm talking about maintaining community standards and fiscal responsibility." "No one said you were being racist," Dr. Kim replied calmly. "But when you refer to community members as outside populations and the wrong element, You're using language that excludes people based on characteristics that have nothing to do with their contributions or qualifications. The meeting ended shortly after that exchange, with Robert storming out and the remaining members awkwardly discussing mundane budget details. But the lines had been drawn clearly. I now knew who would speak up when discrimination happened in front of them and who would choose comfortable silence over difficult conversations. After the meeting, Dr. Kim approached me in the parking lot. "I'm sorry that happened," she said, "and I'm sorry more people didn't speak up. That was unacceptable." I thanked her for her support, but I was also beginning to understand the isolation that comes with being the only person willing to name discrimination when it occurs. Even well-meaning allies often waited for someone else to take the risk of speaking up first, leaving the burden of confronting bias on the very people being targeted by it. That night, I started documenting this incident as well, taking detailed notes about who said what and how different people responded. I was beginning to see that building a case for systematic discrimination required capturing not just the obvious moments of bias, but also the pattern of complicity and silence that allows discriminatory systems to perpetuate themselves. The escalation phase began when I decided to take formal action instead of continuing to absorb discriminatory treatment in silence. I filed a complaint with the State Real Estate Licensing Board about Derek Matthews' steering practices, including detailed documentation of our conversations and the differential treatment Maya had received when inquiring about the same properties. The response from Derek's brokerage was swift and defensive. Within a week, I received a call from their legal department claiming that I had misunderstood Derek's comments and that the firm had a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. They suggested that perhaps I would be more comfortable working with an agent who specialized in diverse communities and could better understand my unique needs. Even their attempt at damage control was discriminatory, suggesting that my race created unique needs that required specialized handling rather than the professional service that any qualified buyer deserved. I also reached out to local fair housing organizations and learned about the formal testing process used to document discriminatory practices. Fair housing testers, volunteers who pose as potential buyers or renters to identify differential treatment, had been documenting systematic steering in the Maplewood Heights area for years. Maria Santos, a housing counselor with the Regional Fair Housing Center, agreed to coordinate a formal testing program using my experience as a starting point. "What you're describing matches patterns we've seen in other suburban communities," she explained. "The challenge is that individual instances can be dismissed as misunderstandings or personality conflicts, but when we document systematic patterns across multiple agents and situations, it becomes much harder to deny that discrimination is occurring." The testing process was eye-opening and infuriating. Over the course of 6 weeks, pairs of testers, one white, one black, with similar financial qualifications, contacted real estate agents throughout the area. The results were consistent and damning. Black testers were shown fewer properties, quoted higher prices, given less information about financing options, and consistently steered away from the most desirable neighborhoods. When I tried to share these findings at the next community center board meeting, I was told that housing issues were outside the scope of our organization's mission, even though we regularly discussed community development and quality of life issues. The message was clear: discrimination was acceptable as long as it was never officially acknowledged or discussed. The retaliation began subtly but escalated quickly. My event planning committee assignments were reduced without explanation. The social media campaign I developed for the fundraising gala was credited to other committee members in the final report. When I asked about joining the education advisory committee that the mayor had suggested, I was told that all positions were currently filled, though 2 new members were announced the following week. At work, I noticed similar patterns. Projects I'd been leading were reassigned to other team members, and I was excluded from client meetings I would normally attend. When I asked my supervisor about these changes, she said the company was reorganizing responsibilities to optimize team dynamics, but she couldn't provide specific explanations for why my role was being diminished. I consulted with an employment attorney who explained that retaliation for filing discrimination complaints could itself be grounds for legal action, but proving the connection between my fair housing complaint and workplace treatment would require extensive documentation and might be difficult to establish definitively. The community division became apparent at local events and gathering spaces. At the farmer's market, vendors who had been warm and welcoming before began keeping conversations short and professional. Parents at Zara's school activities formed conversation circles that excluded me, even when we were discussing shared volunteer responsibilities. The most painful moment came during a school board meeting where I was presenting research about the achievement gap and proposing mentorship programs to support students from underrepresented communities. After my presentation, board member Janet Walsh suggested that perhaps these issues would be better addressed by families who more naturally understand the cultural challenges involved. The implication was clear. As a Black parent, I was being told that my perspective on educational equity was simultaneously too biased to be objective and too removed from the cultural challenges to be authentic. It was a perfect catch-22 designed to exclude my voice, regardless of my qualifications or the quality of my research. The ultimatum moment arrived when Derek Matthews' brokerage firm Premier Properties sent me a formal letter demanding that I withdraw my complaint with the state licensing board or face a defamation lawsuit. They claimed that my allegations were false and malicious and were damaging their business reputation. The letter included a draft settlement agreement that would require me to sign a non-disclosure agreement and pay $5,000 in administrative costs in exchange for them dropping their threatened lawsuit. It was a classic intimidation tactic designed to silence complaints through legal and financial pressure. I had 30 days to respond to their ultimatum, withdraw my complaint and pay them money, or face an expensive legal battle that could drag on for months or years. They were betting that I would choose silence over the time, stress, and expense of fighting back. But by this point, I had connected with a network of allies and advocates who helped me understand that this pattern of intimidation was itself evidence of systematic discrimination. Fair housing organizations, civil rights attorneys, and other families who had faced similar treatment were ready to support me in taking a stand. The pressure tactics included anonymous phone calls to my workplace suggesting I was a troublemaker who filed frivolous lawsuits. Someone posted flyers in my apartment building claiming I was trying to force diversity on communities that didn't want it. Zara started coming home from school with questions about why some of her classmates' parents were saying I was trying to ruin the neighborhood. But for every attempt at intimidation, another ally stepped forward. Dr. Kim organized a group of community center volunteers to document the systematic exclusion they'd witnessed. 3 other families shared their own experiences of housing discrimination in the area. A group of white parents at Zara's school signed a letter supporting my advocacy for educational equity and condemning the retaliation I was facing. Maria Santos connected me with a legal team that specialized in fair housing cases and was willing to represent me on a contingency basis. They explained that Premier Properties' threats were actually violations of federal law which prohibits retaliation against people who file discrimination complaints. As my 30-day deadline approached, local media began covering the story. A reporter from the regional newspaper interviewed me about the systematic steering practices we'd documented, and the story prompted dozens of other families to share similar experiences. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore or dismiss as isolated incidents. The final confrontation took place in the conference room of the State Civil Rights Commission, where I was scheduled to present my formal complaint against Derek Matthews and Premier Properties. The setting was sterile and bureaucratic, fluorescent lighting, beige walls, and a long table where commissioners sat with legal pads and water glasses, looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. Derek and his attorney arrived with a stack of files and a confident demeanor that suggested they expected this to be a routine dismissal. The Premier Properties legal team included 2 lawyers in expensive suits who spread documents across the table like they were preparing for battle. Also present were Maria Santos from the Fair Housing Center, my attorney Janet Morrison, no relation to the Community Center board member, and Dr. Kim, who had volunteered to testify about the community discrimination she'd witnessed. The room felt tense but formal, with everyone maintaining professional courtesy while the stakes became increasingly clear. This wasn't just about my ability to buy a house in Maplewood Heights, it was about whether systematic discrimination would be officially acknowledged and addressed, or whether it would continue to operate under cover of plausible deniability. Derek's defense was predictable and revealing. His attorney argued that Derek was simply trying to be helpful by ensuring I found a home where I would be truly comfortable and my daughter could build meaningful friendships with children from similar backgrounds. Mr. Matthews never said anything about race, his attorney insisted. He was providing thoughtful guidance about community fit and cultural alignment, which is a normal part of professional real estate services. The commission chair, a middle-aged white woman named Patricia Holmes, listened with a neutral expression that gave no indication of her thinking. Two other commissioners, one Latino man and one black woman, took detailed notes and asked clarifying questions about specific statements Derek had made. When Mr. Matthews told my client that some sellers have preferences about maintaining neighborhood character, what exactly did he mean by that? My attorney asked. Derek's response was a masterclass in coded language. I meant that different communities have different personalities and social structures. Some neighborhoods are more formal, some are more casual, some are oriented toward young families, others toward retirees. I was trying to help Miss Johnson find a community where she and her daughter would feel most at home. And why did you assume that Miss Johnson, with her excellent credit and substantial down payment, wouldn't feel at home in Maplewood Heights specifically? The pause before Derek's answer lasted just long enough to be uncomfortable. I never made any assumptions about her feelings. I was simply suggesting that she might want to consider all her options before making such a significant investment. My attorney then presented the testing results that showed Derek and his colleagues consistently steering black clients away from Maplewood Heights while encouraging white clients with similar qualifications to pursue properties there. The evidence was systematic and damning, different treatment based solely on race, documented across multiple interactions and agents. Dr. Kim's testimony was particularly powerful. She described the community center meeting where Robert Henley had referred to me as part of outside populations and the wrong element, and explained how my professional contributions had been marginalized after I began advocating for more inclusive practices. Destiny Johnson is one of the most qualified and dedicated volunteers our organization has ever had, Dr. Kim said firmly. Her treatment changed dramatically after she began speaking up about discriminatory practices, and that change was clearly retaliatory. The truth-telling moment came when I was invited to present my own testimony. I had prepared extensively, organizing my documentation chronologically and focusing on specific factual examples rather than emotional reactions. I want to be clear about what happened here. I began, looking directly at the commissioners. This isn't about my personal feelings being hurt or misunderstanding well-intentioned comments. This is about a systematic pattern of practices designed to exclude qualified black buyers from certain neighborhoods while maintaining plausible deniability about racial motivation. I presented evidence showing that I had been pre-approved for mortgage amounts that exceeded the cost of homes I was interested in, that I had community ties and professional qualifications that made me an ideal neighbor, and that I had been actively contributing to local organizations and institutions. Despite these qualifications, I was consistently steered away from homes in Maplewood Heights through coded language about community fit and neighborhood character. When I tested this treatment by having a white friend inquire about the same properties, she received completely different service, more options, better information, and enthusiastic encouragement to pursue her interest. I also presented the broader context of how discrimination operates in modern housing markets. This isn't about individual prejudice or personal animosity. This is about institutional practices that perpetuate segregation through informal barriers and coded communication. The impact is the same whether the motivation is conscious bias or unconscious adherence to discriminatory systems. The evidence presentation continued with testimony from other families who had experienced similar treatment, statistical analysis of housing patterns in the area, and expert testimony about how steering practices contribute to ongoing segregation. When Premier Properties was asked to respond to the pattern of discriminatory treatment, their attorney argued that individual real estate agents couldn't be held responsible for broader housing patterns and that any differential treatment was coincidental rather than systematic. Correlation is not causation, he said. The fact that Ms. Johnson perceives discrimination doesn't mean that discrimination actually occurred. Real estate agents provide different levels of service to different clients based on many factors, including communication styles, specific needs, and professional rapport. This response was exactly what fair housing advocates had prepared me to expect: the denial of discriminatory intent combined with alternative explanations for discriminatory impact. The attorney was essentially arguing that as long as agents didn't explicitly say we don't serve Black clients, any pattern of differential treatment could be explained away. My attorney's response was swift and precise. Federal fair housing law doesn't require proof of discriminatory intent. It prohibits practices that have discriminatory effect, regardless of motivation. When Black clients consistently receive inferior service compared to white clients with similar qualifications, that constitutes a violation of federal law. The resolution demand was specific and comprehensive. I wasn't just asking for personal compensation or an apology. I was demanding systematic changes that would prevent other families from experiencing the same discrimination. First, Premier Properties would be required to implement mandatory fair housing training for all agents and staff, with annual updates and testing to ensure comprehension. Second, they would establish clear protocols for documenting client interactions and property recommendations, with regular auditing to identify patterns of differential treatment. Third, they would partner with local fair housing organizations to conduct ongoing testing and monitoring of their practices. Fourth, they would contribute $50,000 to a local fair housing education fund that would provide resources for other families facing discrimination. Finally, Derek Matthews would be required to complete additional professional development focused on fair housing law and ethics, and his license would be subject to probationary monitoring for 2 years. The accountability measures included quarterly reports to the State Civil Rights Commission documenting the agency's efforts to ensure equal treatment, public posting of their fair housing policy and complaint procedures, and establishment of a community advisory board that would review concerns about discriminatory practices. The consequences for non-compliance were clearly defined. Failure to implement these changes would result in license suspension, additional financial penalties, and referral to federal authorities for possible criminal prosecution under fair housing laws. The victory moment came when Commissioner Holmes announced the panel's findings. Based on the evidence presented, we find that Premier Properties and Mr. Matthews engaged in discriminatory steering practices that violated both state and federal fair housing laws. The pattern of differential treatment based on race is clear and well documented. She continued, "We order Premier Properties to implement all remedial measures requested by the complainant and to pay $75,000 in damages and civil penalties. Mr. Matthews' license is suspended for 6 months and he must complete fair housing training before reinstatement." The room was silent for a moment as the magnitude of the decision sank in. This wasn't just a personal victory, it was official recognition that systematic discrimination was occurring and that there would be real consequences for perpetuating it. Derek's face had gone pale, and his attorney was already taking notes about potential appeals. But the Premier Properties representative, clearly calculating the cost of continuing to fight versus accepting the judgment, leaned over to whisper with their legal team. Dr. Kim squeezed my hand under the table, and Maria Santos smiled broadly. After months of documentation, testing, and legal preparation, we had achieved something that rarely happens in discrimination cases: a clear victory with meaningful consequences and systematic changes. The immediate aftermath of the Commission's decision was surreal. As we walked out of the building, I felt simultaneously exhausted and energized, relieved and overwhelmed. The victory was significant, but I also knew that it was just the beginning of a longer process of ensuring that the required changes were actually implemented. Local media coverage was extensive and largely supportive. The newspaper story about the decision prompted dozens of calls and emails from other families sharing their own experiences of housing discrimination. Some thanked me for speaking up, others shared stories that made it clear this problem extended far beyond one real estate agency. Within a week, 3 other real estate companies in the area had voluntarily updated their fair housing policies and announced new training programs for their agents. While this was encouraging, I suspected it was more about protecting themselves from similar complaints than genuine commitment to change. The community reaction was mixed and revealing, and supporters organized a celebration dinner at the community center, with Dr. Kim presenting me with a plaque recognizing my courage and persistence in fighting for equal treatment. About 30 people attended, including several families I'd never met who thanked me for creating a path for others to follow. But there was also backlash. Anonymous flyers appeared around the neighborhood claiming I was a professional victim who was destroying property values with frivolous lawsuits. Someone spray-painted race baiter on the sidewalk outside my apartment building, though it was cleaned up within hours. My personal feelings were complex and evolving. The validation of having my experiences officially recognized as discrimination was incredibly important. It confirmed that I hadn't been imagining or exaggerating the treatment I'd received. But the process had also been emotionally exhausting and had exposed me to levels of scrutiny and retaliation that took months to fully process. The institutional changes began to take effect over the following months. Premier Properties implemented the required training programs and policy changes, though their compliance was clearly grudging rather than enthusiastic. Derek Matthews completed his suspension and additional education, but he left the real estate industry entirely 6 months later. More significantly, the State Civil Rights Commission used our case as a model for developing new enforcement protocols and training materials. They began conducting proactive testing in other communities with similar demographic patterns and historical segregation. The Maplewood Heights Community Center also made changes, establishing a formal anti-discrimination policy and requiring cultural competency training for all board members and committee chairs. Robert Henley resigned from the board rather than participate in the training, but his departure allowed more diverse voices to join the organization's leadership. New accountability measures included anonymous reporting procedures for community members who experienced discrimination, regular demographic analysis of program participation to identify barriers to inclusion, and partnership agreements with organizations serving underrepresented communities. The ongoing monitoring process involved quarterly meetings between fair housing organizations, community leaders, and real estate professionals to assess progress and address emerging concerns. These meetings were sometimes tense, but they created a forum for addressing discriminatory practices before they escalated to formal complaints. My personal growth through this experience was profound and ongoing. I developed a much deeper understanding of how systematic discrimination operates and how individual actions can either perpetuate or challenge discriminatory systems. The confidence I gained from successfully fighting back against institutional racism transformed how I approached other areas of my life. The relationships I built with genuine allies became some of my most valued friendships. Dr. Kim and I began co-facilitating workshops on recognizing and addressing discrimination in community organizations. Maria Santos invited me to join the Fair Housing Center's board of directors, where I could help develop programs for other families facing similar challenges. Most importantly, I learned to trust my own perceptions and to speak up when I witnessed discrimination, even when doing so was uncomfortable or risky. The skills I developed in documenting incidents, building coalitions, and advocating for systematic change became tools I used in other contexts throughout my career and community involvement. My sense of purpose became much clearer through this experience. While I had always been committed to professional success and community involvement, fighting housing discrimination gave me a deeper understanding of how individual actions can contribute to broader social change. The ripple effects extended far beyond my own situation. 3 other families used the precedent from my case to file their own fair housing complaints, and 2 achieved successful settlements. The publicity around discriminatory steering practices led to increased awareness and more careful monitoring by real estate professionals throughout the region. Several community organizations invited me to speak about recognizing and addressing discrimination, and these presentations often prompted audience members to share their own experiences and seek resources for addressing bias they had encountered. The mentorship role that emerged from my advocacy became one of the most rewarding aspects of the entire experience. Families facing housing discrimination began reaching out for advice and support, and I was able to help them navigate the complaint process with less stress and better outcomes than I had experienced. My ongoing advocacy expanded to include testifying at state legislative hearings about fair housing enforcement and serving on a task force developing best practices for real estate training programs. These opportunities allowed me to contribute to policy changes that would prevent other families from experiencing the discrimination I had faced. The broader impact on the community was gradual but measurable. Over the following 2 years, the percentage of Black families purchasing homes in Maplewood Heights increased from less than 2% to nearly 8%. While this was still far from reflecting regional demographics, it represented significant progress from the virtual exclusion that had existed previously. Community events began including more diverse speakers and programming, and the neighborhood's reputation shifted from being known for exclusivity to being recognized for its efforts to address historical discrimination. This change attracted families who were specifically looking for communities committed to inclusion and diversity. The most significant ongoing change was the establishment of a regional fair housing coalition that included real estate professionals, community leaders, advocacy organizations, and residents committed to preventing discrimination. This coalition developed educational materials, conducted regular testing, and provided support for families experiencing bias in housing markets. Looking back on this experience 3 years later, I understand that fighting discrimination is not a one-time battle with a clear ending. It's an ongoing process of recognizing bias, building coalitions, demanding accountability, and creating systems that make equal treatment the norm rather than the exception. The key insights I gained from this experience center on understanding the difference between individual prejudice and systematic discrimination. While individual bias is certainly harmful, systematic discrimination operates through institutional practices and cultural norms that exclude people regardless of individual attitudes or intentions. Pattern recognition became a crucial skill, learning to identify when isolated incidents are actually part of larger discriminatory systems. The ability to document these patterns systematically and present them as evidence rather than personal grievances was essential for achieving meaningful change. Understanding allyship was another critical lesson. Real allies don't just express sympathy when discrimination occurs, they take action to challenge discriminatory practices and use their own positions and privileges to advocate for change. Dr. Kim demonstrated this kind of allyship by speaking up during meetings, testifying at hearings, and using her professional credibility to validate my experiences. The most important insight was learning to trust my own perceptions and experiences while building coalitions that could validate and amplify my concerns. Discrimination often operates by making targets question their own judgment and feel isolated in their experiences. Breaking through that isolation by connecting with others and building documented evidence was essential for successful advocacy. Self-worth was perhaps the most personal lesson. I learned that demanding equal treatment is not being demanding, it's recognizing that I deserve the same opportunities and respect as anyone else. The system of discrimination relied on my acceptance of inferior treatment, and refusing that acceptance was itself an act of resistance. For other people of color who might be facing similar discrimination, my advice starts with trusting your instincts. If something feels discriminatory, it probably is, and your perceptions are valid even when others suggest you're being oversensitive or reading too much into situations. Documentation is crucial for building a strong case. Keep detailed records of discriminatory incidents, including dates, times, names, exact quotes, and witnesses. Save emails, text messages, and any other written communication that shows patterns of differential treatment. Building a support network is essential both for emotional resilience and practical advocacy. Connect with fair housing organizations, civil rights groups, and other families who have faced similar challenges. These connections provide both validation and practical resources for fighting discrimination effectively. Self-care throughout the process is not optional. It's necessary for sustained advocacy. Fighting discrimination is emotionally and physically exhausting, and you need support systems and coping strategies to maintain your energy and perspective throughout what can be a long process. Warning signs to watch for include coded language about community fit, neighborhood character, or cultural alignment. Being steered away from certain areas despite meeting financial qualifications, receiving different service quality than white clients, and being subjected to additional scrutiny or requirements are all red flags that warrant further investigation. For white allies who want to be genuinely helpful rather than performatively supportive, start by listening to and believing people of color when they describe discriminatory experiences. Don't minimize their concerns or suggest alternative explanations for clearly biased treatment. Use your own positions and privileges to advocate for change rather than expecting people of color to fight discrimination alone. Speak up when you witness discriminatory behavior, even when it's uncomfortable or socially awkward to do so. Support policy changes and institutional reforms that address systematic discrimination rather than focusing only on individual attitudes or awareness. Meaningful change requires changing systems, not just changing minds. Educate yourself about housing discrimination and other forms of bias so you can recognize them when they occur and respond effectively. Don't expect people of color to educate you about discrimination while they're experiencing it. For institutions and organizations that want to prevent discrimination, start by acknowledging that bias exists in your systems and committing to ongoing efforts to identify and address it. Develop clear policies prohibiting discrimination and establish procedures for reporting and investigating complaints. Provide regular training for staff and leadership that goes beyond legal compliance to focus on recognizing unconscious bias and creating inclusive environments. Make this training mandatory and ongoing rather than a one-time requirement. Partner with advocacy organizations and community groups to conduct regular monitoring and assessment of your practices. Outside perspectives are essential for identifying bias that internal stakeholders might not recognize. Create accountability measures that include consequences for discriminatory behavior and rewards for inclusive practices. Change requires both positive incentives and negative consequences for maintaining the status quo. Educational resources for continued learning include the National Fair Housing Alliance, which provides comprehensive information about housing discrimination and advocacy strategies. Local fair housing organizations offer testing services, legal support, and educational programs specific to your area. The Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice maintains updated information about federal fair housing laws and enforcement actions. State civil rights commissions provide resources for filing complaints and understanding local protections. Community organizations like the NAACP, Urban League, and local civil rights groups offer advocacy training, legal referrals, and support networks for families facing discrimination. Academic research on housing discrimination provides important context for understanding how bias operates in modern housing markets and what interventions are most effective for creating change. The shared experience of discrimination is unfortunately common, but the power of connecting with others who understand these challenges cannot be overstated. Building communities of support and advocacy creates the collective strength necessary to challenge systematic bias effectively. Resource sharing about effective strategies, legal options, and support services helps each family facing discrimination benefit from the experiences of those who have fought similar battles. This sharing accelerates progress and reduces the isolation that discrimination is designed to create. Collective action multiplies the impact of individual advocacy efforts. When multiple families speak up about discriminatory practices, patterns become undeniable and institutions are forced to respond with systematic changes rather than isolated fixes. The hope that sustains this work comes from evidence that change is possible when people refuse to accept discriminatory treatment and work together to demand better. Every successful complaint creates precedent for others, and every institution that changes its practices makes progress for entire communities. My final call to action is directed toward everyone who believes in equal opportunity and fair treatment. For people of color experiencing discrimination, I encourage you to speak up, document your experiences, seek support, and refuse to accept inferior treatment. Your voice matters, your experiences are valid, and change is possible when you demand it. For white allies, I challenge you to move beyond sympathy to action. Use your positions, privileges, and platforms to advocate for systematic change. Speak up when you witness discrimination, support families fighting bias, and work to change the systems that perpetuate inequality. For institutions and organizations, I call on you to proactively examine your practices, policies, and cultures for evidence of bias. Don't wait for complaints to force change. Take responsibility for creating inclusive environments that welcome everyone regardless of race or background. For policymakers and community leaders, I urge you to strengthen fair housing enforcement, support advocacy organizations, and create accountability measures that ensure equal treatment is reality rather than just rhetoric. The fight for fair housing and equal treatment continues every day in communities across this country. Each person who refuses to accept discrimination and demands better makes progress possible for everyone. Together, we can create communities where families are welcomed based on their contributions and character rather than excluded based on their race. 3 years after that first discriminatory conversation with Derek Matthews, I did eventually buy a house in Maplewood Heights, not because the discrimination disappeared, but because I refused to let discriminatory practices determine where my family could live. The house is beautiful, Zara is thriving in school, and our neighbors have learned that diversity strengthens rather than threatens their community. But more importantly, the precedent set by fighting back against systematic discrimination has created opportunities for other families and established accountability measures that make equal treatment more likely for everyone. That progress represents the real victory, not just changing my own circumstances, but contributing to systematic change that benefits entire communities. The work continues because equality requires constant vigilance and ongoing advocacy. But the evidence is clear that progress is possible when people refuse to accept discrimination and work together to demand the fair treatment that everyone deserves.